Hey, what's up, you fitters? It's Isaac, and I'm here with Steve De Tomaso. Steve has his bachelor's degree in human kinetics, as well as competed in the Canada Triathlon. Ironman, excuse me. And then he's training for a marathon coming up. So Steve is going to give us a little lowdown on his expertise on distance running, as well as shoes and footwear. So first of all, Steve, let me ask you, you wrote a great three-part blog post on running shoes. Can you go over that with us a little bit and recap in video, kind of your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I wrote a couple on minimalist versus traditional shoes. Basically, it was what is better for you, traditional or minimal. This kind of started with a running symposium that we both, my business partner and I, attended, and we were looking at basically the differences between the two types of running shoes and defining those to start. So essentially, you're wearing the same shoes I am, but I'll take this off. And so this is a fairly flexible shoe, and it's fairly light. It's got a 4mm rise to the heel. So this is what would be classified as a minimal shoe. I don't really see anyone else. Pass me your shoe.
Well, Kerry's got Nike Freeze on.
Shoe?
Yeah. Those have more cushion in.
So this is still what I would consider a minimalist. That's still a minimalist shoe.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
You might have to edit this. This shoe stinks, by the way.
Yeah, it's old. It's an old shoe.
This has got a bit more of a pitch. It's a little bit heavier than what I was running before. And this actually has a sole. It's a little bit flexible, but not nearly as flexible as running before. So this is more along the lines of what I would consider to be a traditional shoe. Typically, a traditional shoe would have a rise from forefoot to heel of about 10mm or more. Usually you're looking at 12, 14. You can envision a Nike Shock, not to put Nike under the bus because there's lots of shoes, but they've got a pretty big heel rise, and it actually changes your movement patterns when you run. So I'll give that back to you. So now if you can imagine yourself running with a minimalist shoe, it's going to be a little bit different than running in a traditional shoe. This is going to simulate a barefoot running pattern. Now a barefoot running pattern, what you do is you would land with your forefoot, and I think Isaac mentioned he wanted me to talk about pronation and supination before. So if you were walking, supination is a natural pattern that you would roll your foot would roll to the outside and striking the heel first. And if you're walking in pronation, that means your heel would strike and your foot would roll inwards. These are fairly natural patterns that are used when we're walking. Now, if you're running and you're heel striking, those patterns happen at an accelerated pace, and that can actually be a dangerous thing. So that's when the traditional shoes kind of came along and solved that problem by having motion control features in these shoes. Excuse the guy watching. And what happens is, if you run a minimalist shoe, it's going to mimic that barefoot mechanic, and so you actually won't be running on your heel. You'll land on your forefoot, and so you'll do something that's called land, lever, lift. So you'll land with the forefoot, kind of a flat foot, and the heel might touch down a little bit, that's normal. Then you'll lever forward and lift the foot up. And so there's never a heel strike, and so the foot never rolls over into a pronation or supination. So the need for those features in a shoe doesn't exist. You don't need it.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's great. So now we've got the shoe wear kind of figured out. Let's talk a little bit about beginning running basics. So fundamentals are something that we always stress, that we all know is important. Obviously, I deal a little bit more with, we do high knees and sprints like that in boot camp, and most of my clients are aware of that. But tell me a little bit about some of the things you work with your clients or anyone who comes to you for distance running, and just the very beginning basics.
Yeah, so I don't specifically work on running form for runners, not in the gym anyway. More or less, they're going to have issues with strength. They're going to come to me with an endurance base. So we're just talking general population that want to get out and run. Typically, they're pretty jacked up and they just need to move better. So all you really need to do as far as in the gym goes, you want to make sure that you have good posture. So I'm not trying to work on high knee drills or B-skips or something like that with them. We're just more or less looking at posture, making sure that mobility in the hips is good. So they've got sort of a prerequisite range of motion that they can get into a normal running pattern. So a real simple drill that I would do with them is just a basic marching drill. So standing in one spot, marching. Now you're going to notice that my heels are not touching the ground as I march here. And if I pick up my pace, same thing, my heel's not touching the ground. All I would do from that is I'd go into a slight forward lean, and I'm running. And when I'm doing that, I'm running on my forefoot. So that's how I would get someone, instead of doing all fancy drills, because people won't really appreciate that or remember that when they get out to whatever they're doing, but that's something really easy that you can do to kind of get people into what I would call a natural running strategy.
Beautiful, beautiful. So obviously that's great. Now you mentioned hip mobility.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about what you do to look at someone's hip mobility to make sure that they have enough range of motion for their running.
Sure. Well, we can do a little gray cook. So I'll set up you, Isaac,
Sure.
in a, we'll face this way.
Okay.
So let's get your feet shoulder width apart. Isaac's good. He's got decent hip mobility. Nice shallow hip sockets. And I'll get your arms up. And now let's get you to squat down. And so what I'm looking for here is that he can break parallel, and then he's got a good line parallel with the shin there. You can stand back up. And I'm looking for, just a little more. I'm looking to see that there's no shifts. It actually doesn't look too bad today. Back up.
I've been working on it.
To see if there's anything going on as far as the stability goes too. Stability in the hips is also very important. The glute med is very active when you're running, and so if you see a shift, there might be a little dysfunction there, and that might have to be addressed in the gym as well. So the strength training is really going to complement running in the strength and stability component, not so much the endurance component. That's something you would probably avoid in the gym because they're already getting enough endurance work outside the gym.
Excellent, excellent. Now I'm going to do a few back squats. I'm going to show you a few squats that I see a lot. Maybe you can show me what you would work on if you saw squats that look like this, or some techniques you would use.
Put me on the spot, eh?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Pro, right? So here's a squat that I see a lot. It looks like this.
Right.
Okay, right? Stuck here, leaning forward too much. So what would you say, kind of looking at hip mobility, what would you attack?
Well, if it's a mobility issue, I mean, it could be mobility or stability. It's definitely something on the backside. So we're either looking at hamstring. It could be something to do with the lats as well. It might not even be hip related. And so we would just go down the chain and eliminate through a few different drills, none that I can think of off the top of my head. But we could take you with a TRX, put those behind your, hook them up to your hands, put some pressure at the back there, and if you can squat down and it's no problem, then that eliminates the idea that it might be actually a mobility issue. It actually might be a stability issue, and then we can address that instead. So I would probably run, in fact, I would run a full screen, which is a 7-point screen, the squat. It tells me some information of what could be going on, but it's not really the full deal.
Excellent. So just because you can't do something doesn't mean it's always you don't have enough range of motion. There's also stability things that go into it. Just like if you have a hurt muscle, a lot of times a tight muscle is actually a weak muscle. So it's not that you just stretch it because it feels tight. There's different things that are going on there. And Steve made a great point there. Steve, tell me a little bit, last question here for you. If someone was looking at doing a running program and you were maybe programming out, how do you kind of get accumulated to running? It's not as simple as just going out, I'm going to run a mile today, I'm going to run half a mile. How do you slowly build up accumulation into a long distance running program? What are some ideas that you have?
Well, first thing, because we talked about shoes before, I'll mention that if you are going to start a running program and you're a beginner runner, start with the most minimal shoe that you can tolerate. Don't go with what the guy at the Nike store tells you and says, oh, you need this motion control. We did these foot tests and that kind of stuff. I was at the running symposium in Vancouver, like I was saying before, and what they had some new research that they had just been working on, and they had a new study that they actually had 2 groups where there was, I think, about 150 people in each group. One group was assigned a shoe for their foot type, and the other group was assigned a randomized shoe. So they gave you performance neutral, stability, didn't even matter. And they gave these 2 groups the same running program, and they trained them for 6 weeks for a 10K. It might have been longer than that. But in that time, what they noticed is the injury rates for both groups stayed the same. So what that tells me, and what that should tell everyone, is that it doesn't really matter what shoe that you're running in. And so what came out of that is go for the minimalist shoe, the most minimal shoe that you can tolerate, and then you would want to build up mileage slowly over time. What you'll notice, especially with the minimalist shoe, is that you'll get a lot of lower leg tightness, so you don't want to overload that. And now there's all different sort of ideas on how you should accumulate volume, but it's basically don't increase your volume more than 10% a week. And so what your starting volume is, it might be running for 5 minutes. It kind of depends a little bit on fitness level as well. But if you find you run once, say you run for, I know you guys are in miles, but say if you run for a half mile, and the next day you're real sore, and then you're sore for an additional 2 days after that, well, you probably overdid it. So you want to just kind of feel it out. And that's kind of your starting volume. And then you want to just increase 10% per week.
And your thoughts on shoes as not necessarily going for a more minimalistic shoe. Does that also apply for orthotics too?
Yeah, well, you know what? Orthotics, a little bit of a different scenario. I think that there are shoes, or that there are feet that do need some support. So there will be a foot that will have an arch that will fall. And so that foot, what it needs more than anything else is probably some retraining. I'm not a podiatrist, so I can't really speak on should you or should you not have it, but I think at some point you can eliminate it. A lot of minimalist shoes will accept an orthotic, and so you're still going to get the benefit of not maybe necessarily training the foot, but you'll still get that proprioceptive feedback, which I didn't talk about before. But when you have a relatively thin sole and not a lot of cushioning on the ground, you can actually feel the ground a lot better, and so that helps you pattern more precise movement. Precise movement is really important because we've kind of lost that with footwear, with kind of, I don't know, with training in general these days. And so you see a lot of sloppy stuff happen in the gym. And you see a lot of sloppy runners out there. And I don't want you guys to be sloppy runners.
Exactly. We appreciate that. Another question I have is about lifting. When you lift, do you lift in the same shoes that you run in necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, I could. I specifically don't. I have really specialized shoes for running that I do prefer. Now I say don't use cushioning when you're outside running. Now it's not completely true just because we don't run on natural surfaces per se. We are running on concrete and asphalt, we're running on the road. And so I do think, my personal opinion is that it can require a little bit of cushioning, but you do need some sort of feedback. So the shoes I have a little bit of both of that. They have a little bit of support in the forefoot, not so much in the heel. There's still that feedback through a membrane. It pushes up. They're actually called a Newton. I don't have them here today, but they're real cool. There's these lugs on the bottom that push up into the forefoot, so you can actually feel the ground underneath you, but you still have some cushion.
Wow, that's really cool. I've never heard that before, too. Last question for you is just about shin splints. So if someone's getting shin splints running, do you usually find that's an accumulation of too much volume? What are your thoughts on shin splints and that problem?
Yeah, typically there's all different kind of, shin splints is kind of a big category. It's usually, or it could be, muscular tightness in the tibialis anterior. It could be that you've got a stress fracture. That would be the kind of worst case scenario. Typically what that's caused for is a spike of impact, typical of a heel strike. And you can actually get, when you strike the ground with your heel, you can get a double impact, so you strike here, and then you roll forward into another forceful push, and you can hear sometimes, if you've been in clubs before, where there's people running on the treadmill and you hear this thump, 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 thump. That's kind of like your heel striker typical thing. So what you can do to reduce that is, one, run in minimal shoes, and two, don't increase your volume too fast, because those two things, too much volume, or possibly too much volume and intensity, those will kind of give you that repetitive strain that can cause shin splints. The heel strike as well. What I do recommend as far as your training goes is to mix up your training. Don't always train at the same speed, because that'll cause the same strain on the same muscles, on the same joints over time, and the same type of terrain, the same thing. So if you mix up the speed, so if you've heard of fartlek training before, you heard of that? So if you do some speed play within your training where you pick up the intensity, slow it down, that's going to change things up a little bit. If you change the terrain up, so say you go and you run some trails one day, well, that's going to give your body a whole bunch of different stimulus, right? Different proprioceptive feedback, and it's really cool for stabilizing your ankle joint, knee joint, hip joint, that kind of stuff. And then if you do some hill training where you're running uphill, that is also going to give you different stimulus. Actually, running uphill is probably one of the best ways you can start out running. It's actually going to build really good specific running strength. It's going to be low impact because you're running uphill and there's no eccentric component, and it's going to improve your distance per stride working on that specific strength, and that will improve your running speed. So.
Now, when we're talking about different running ways to run, I've seen some people say, man, I got to run backwards because I'm always going forwards to balance it out. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool for a cool down, and if you watch someone running backwards, it should look like what they look like when they're running forward. So if you put in reverse in video, it should look the same, pretty close. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you might see some ugly things, and you might say, hey, don't run backwards. But yeah, it makes sense to balance people out that way, but I mean, I think a lot of the balance also comes from doing your strength work in the gym.
Exactly. Hey, you're very knowledgeable, Steve. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much. You guys got that video. Great information. And if you have more information, how can you get more information about you, Steve, and your blog?
Yes, check us out at envision-fitness.ca. Our blog is on there. It'll link you to our Facebook page as well. We're posting up stuff regularly, so check us out.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.